The ballroom fell silent except for the clinking of champagne glasses and my daughter-in-law's voice cutting through the air like a knife. Well, at least now we can have a real family without the constant interference. 200 faces turned toward me, their expressions ranging from shock to pity to barely concealed amusement. I stood there in my lilac dress, the one I'd bought specifically for this day, feeling every eye boring into my skin. My son didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. That's when I knew. I had already lost him, maybe years ago, and I'd been too blind to see it. But let me take you back 3 months earlier, to when I still believed everything would work out if I just tried hard enough. I lived in Phoenix, in a modest ranch-style home with a porch that caught the morning sun just right. My son Marcus had been my whole world after his father passed when he was 12. I raised him alone, working double shifts as a nurse to put him through college, to give him opportunities I never had. When he met Victoria at a corporate event in Scottsdale, I was thrilled. She seemed polished, ambitious, everything I thought he deserved. I remember thinking, finally, he's found someone worthy of him. I remember the exact moment Marcus first told me about Victoria. He'd come over for our usual Sunday dinner. This was before Victoria entered the picture and changed everything. We were sitting at my small kitchen table, the one I'd bought secondhand 20 years ago, eating pot roast with carrots and potatoes. Marcus's eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child on Christmas morning. "Mom, I met someone," he said, and the joy in his voice made my heart swell. "She's incredible, smart, successful, driven. She works in marketing for a tech company, and she's already made director at 32. I was thrilled. After a string of relationships that fizzled out, after years of watching him throw himself into his career at the expense of everything else, I thought this might finally be it. "Tell me everything," I said, refilling his water glass, playing the role I'd perfected over 3 decades, the eager listener, the supportive mother, the woman whose happiness came from seeing her son happy. He described their first meeting at a corporate networking event, how she'd been wearing this emerald dress that made her stand out in a sea of dark suits, how they'd talked for 3 hours about everything from business strategy to their favorite childhood books. "She's from a really successful family, Mom. Her dad owns several commercial real estate properties across Arizona. Her mom sits on the board of the symphony. They have this ranch in Fountain Hills that's been in the family for generations." I should have heard the warning in his tone, the subtle emphasis on her family's success, the unconscious comparison to what I could offer. But I was too happy for him, too relieved that he'd found someone to notice the subtext. "She sounds wonderful," I said. "When can I meet her?" The pause that followed should have told me everything. "Soon," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We're just keeping things casual for now, not rushing into family introductions." But 3 weeks later, I saw a photo on Facebook of Victoria with Marcus's arm around her at her parents' country club, surrounded by what was clearly her extended family. He'd been introduced to them, but was keeping me at arm's length. Even then, I made excuses for him. They lived closer to her family. It was more convenient. I was being oversensitive. Their engagement was quick, 6 months from first date to ring. Victoria came from money, old Arizona ranch money, the kind that built wings on hospitals and had streets named after them. I should have seen the warning signs then, the way she'd correct my grammar at dinner, the subtle wrinkle of her nose when she visited my neighborhood. But I was so desperate to be part of their happiness that I convinced myself these were just quirks, nothing more. The first dinner we had together, I spent 3 days preparing. I cleaned my house until it gleamed, bought new placemats and cloth napkins I couldn't really afford, practiced my best recipes. I made coq au vin, a dish I'd learned from a French cookbook and had perfected over the years. I set the table carefully, put out fresh flowers from my garden, wore my best dress, not the lilac one that came later, but a navy blue sheath that I thought made me look sophisticated. Victoria arrived in designer jeans that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill and a cashmere sweater that looked impossibly soft. She surveyed my living room with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between polite interest and barely concealed disappointment. "What a cozy space," she said, and I didn't realize until later that cozy was code for small and inadequate. Dinner was a minefield of small humiliations I didn't recognize as such at the time. When I mispronounced coq au vin, saying it the way I'd always said it, Victoria gently corrected me with the proper French pronunciation, followed by, "But honestly, authentic French cuisine is so hard to execute properly at home. That's why we usually just go to Café Provence when we want the real thing." When I mentioned a book I'd enjoyed, she said, "Oh, I think I saw that on some airport bestseller list. I tend to stick to literary fiction, personally." Marcus said nothing during these moments. He ate his dinner, complimented the food briefly, and let Victoria set the tone for the evening. I told myself he was just nervous, wanting both of us to like each other, caught in the middle. I didn't see what was actually happening, that he'd already chosen her version of the world over mine, that he was already embarrassed by the modest life I'd provided, that I was being auditioned for a role in their life rather than welcomed as a central figure. After that dinner, I asked Marcus privately what he thought. "Victoria really liked you, Mom," he said. But his voice had that careful tone people use when they're lying to protect someone's feelings. "She thought dinner was nice. She's just used to a different lifestyle, you know? Give her time to adjust." The responsibility was placed on me. I needed to give her time. I needed to be patient. I needed to understand. It never occurred to either of us that she should make an effort to appreciate what I offered, to value the work and love I'd put into that evening. The wedding planning became my part-time job. Victoria's mother had very specific ideas about everything, and somehow those ideas always seemed to clash with mine. I suggested a local florist I'd known for years, someone who did beautiful work at reasonable prices. Victoria's mother laughed, actually laughed, and said they were using someone who'd done arrangements for a senator's daughter. When I offered to help with the invitations to save money, Victoria gently but firmly explained they'd hired a calligrapher. My offers to contribute were met with polite refusals that felt like tiny rejections, one after another. The first venue meeting was an education in how little my input mattered. Victoria's mother, Constance, scheduled it at 11 on a Tuesday morning without asking if I could make it. I had to call in sick to work, losing a day's pay I couldn't really afford, but I wasn't going to miss being part of this decision. The venue was a resort in Paradise Valley. All travertine floors and soaring ceilings and views of Camelback Mountain that took your breath away. We sat in the events coordinator's office, Constance, Victoria, Victoria's sister Alexis, and me, reviewing packages that started at $50,000. $50,000 for one day. I made that much in a year as a nurse. The coordinator went through options like they were discussing which variety of apple to buy at the grocery store, completely casual about numbers that made my head spin. "We want the platinum package," Constance said decisively, "with the premium bar service and the quartet for the ceremony. Oh, and we'll need the bridal suite for the day of preparations." She didn't consult Victoria, didn't ask for input. This was clearly a decision that had been made before I arrived. I tried to contribute something, anything. "The gold package looks beautiful too," I offered, pointing to an option that was $20,000 less. "The differences seem pretty minor, and you could use the savings for the honeymoon." The three of them looked at me like I'd suggested serving hot dogs at the reception. "Helen," Constance said, her voice dripping with patience reserved for small children and the mentally impaired, "this is Victoria's only wedding. We're not going to cut corners on the most important day of her life." The implication was clear. Someone like me might cut corners, might think in terms of budgets and savings, but people like them knew better. Victoria added, "We want everything to be perfect, Helen. I'm sure you understand." And I did understand. I understood that my financial reality, my working-class perspective, my practical suggestions were embarrassments to be tolerated and dismissed. Marcus, who was supposed to join us but got called into work, heard about this exchange later. His response? "They're just excited, Mom." Try not to take it personally. How do you not take it personally when everything about you, your income, your home, your neighborhood, your suggestions, is implicitly criticized and found wanting? I told myself it was just wedding stress. Everyone knows weddings bring out the worst in people, right? I kept showing up, kept offering help, kept trying to find my place in this new family structure. The thing about being slowly erased is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's not dramatic. It's 1,000 small moments where you realize you're not quite necessary anymore, where your presence is tolerated rather than welcomed. The dress shopping day was particularly brutal. Victoria had invited her mother, her sister, 3 bridesmaids, and her future mother-in-law, me. We went to this boutique in Scottsdale where the cheapest dress cost more than my monthly mortgage. I sat on a velvet couch, sipping champagne I didn't want, watching Victoria emerge in gown after gown, each more spectacular than the last. Her mother gushed over every detail, and I tried to join in. But my compliments seemed to fall flat, like they were in the wrong language. The boutique was called Maison de la Mariée, and stepping inside was like entering a different world. Crystal chandeliers, thick carpet that swallowed sound, walls of white and ivory silk and tulle. A staff member offered us champagne in actual crystal flutes. I accepted one to have something to do with my hands. But I don't really drink, and the bubbles made my nose tickle. Victoria emerged from the dressing room in the first gown, a strapless mermaid style with intricate beading that caught the light. She looked stunning, objectively beautiful. "Oh my God, darling!" Constance gasped, hands clasped to her chest. "You look like a princess." The bridesmaids cooed and exclaimed. Alexis pulled out her phone to take photos. I sat there, unsure of when to speak, feeling like an audience member watching a performance I hadn't been given a script for. When there was a pause in the gushing, I offered, "You look beautiful, Victoria." She glanced at me briefly, smiled politely, and turned back to the 3-way mirror to examine herself from every angle. My compliment had been acknowledged and dismissed in one smooth motion. This pattern repeated with the next 5 dresses. Victoria would emerge, her mother and sister and friends would erupt in enthusiasm, and I would offer some quieter version of praise that seemed to evaporate before reaching anyone's ears. I started to wonder why I'd been invited. Not to contribute, my opinion clearly didn't matter. To pay? But they didn't need my money. To fulfill some obligation of including the groom's mother? That felt closest to the truth. When Victoria asked what I thought about a particular dress, I said honestly that I thought the previous one had been more flattering. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Her mother gave me a look that could have frozen lava, and Victoria's smile became tight and cold. "Well," she said, "I suppose not everyone has an eye for haute couture." The bridesmaids tittered nervously, and I felt my face burn with shame. In the car on the way home, I cried. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet tears that I wiped away at red lights, hoping other drivers couldn't see. I'd been trying so hard to be part of this, to be supportive and helpful and included, and instead I'd been humiliated for offering an honest opinion when asked. The worst part was knowing Marcus would hear about this, that Victoria would describe me as difficult or critical, and he'd believe her version because her version fit the narrative they'd already constructed about me. I know you're probably screaming at your screen right now, telling me I should have seen it coming, that I should have stood up for myself. But here's the thing about love, especially a mother's love. It makes you stupid. It makes you accept things you'd never tolerate from anyone else. It makes you believe that if you just give a little more, try a little harder, everything will smooth out. I was trapped in that belief, like a fly in amber. I sacrificed more than just my pride. I gave them money when they needed a down payment on their house in Paradise Valley, $20,000 from my retirement savings. I told myself it was an investment in their future, in my future relationship with them and any grandchildren they might have. Marcus promised to pay me back within a year. That was 3 years ago, and we've never spoken about it again. When I brought it up once, gently, Victoria looked at me like I'd asked to borrow her kidney. The conversation about the down payment money happened over brunch at their request. They'd asked me to meet them at a restaurant in Scottsdale, one of those places with a 2-hour wait on weekends and entrees that cost $30. I should have known something was up. They never invited me to restaurants like that, never included me in their social dining experiences. Marcus started with small talk about work, about their house hunt, about how competitive the Paradise Valley market was. Then he shifted into what was clearly a rehearsed speech. "Mom, we found the perfect house. It's exactly what we've been looking for. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, updated kitchen, pool, great school district for when we have kids. The problem is, we're just short on the down payment. We have most of it, but we need another $20,000 to make the offer competitive." I should have said no right then. I should have explained that $20,000 was a significant portion of my retirement savings, that I couldn't afford to just give that away, that they were both successful professionals who could save up or find another house. But Marcus looked at me with those eyes that were still, somewhere under the successful businessman exterior, the little boy I'd raised alone, and I couldn't say no. "We'll pay you back within a year, I promise," he said. "With both our salaries, we can easily set aside $2,000 a month. We'll have you paid back in no time, with interest if you want." Victoria added, "We really want you to be part of this, Helen. This house is where your grandchildren will grow up someday. You'd be investing in family memories, in all of us." The emotional manipulation was so smooth, I barely felt it, like a skilled pickpocket lifting your wallet while shaking your hand. I transferred the money the next day. They got the house. 3 months later, they redid the entire master bathroom at a cost of $35,000. 6 months after that, they installed a custom outdoor kitchen. The year anniversary of the loan came and went without mention of repayment. When I finally brought it up, trying to be casual about it, Marcus said, "Oh, right. Things have been tight with the house expenses. We'll get you back soon." Victoria's expression made it clear she thought I was being tacky for mentioning money at all. I gave them my time too, endless hours of it. I babysat their golden retriever every weekend for 6 months while they renovated their kitchen, even though I'm allergic and had to take antihistamines that made me drowsy at work. I organized Marcus's 40th birthday party, spending weeks coordinating with his friends, baking his favorite German chocolate cake from scratch, decorating their backyard with lights I hung myself despite my fear of heights. Victoria thanked me perfunctorily, then spent the next week texting her friends about how the decorations hadn't matched her aesthetic. The dog-sitting situation was particularly absurd in retrospect. They'd adopted Cooper, a beautiful golden retriever puppy, right before deciding to renovate their kitchen. The renovation meant workers in the house all day, noise and chaos, and they didn't want Cooper stressed or underfoot. "Could you possibly take him during the days?" Victoria asked, in that way that sounded like a question, but was really a statement. "Just on weekends when we want to be on-site supervising. Maybe Friday through Sunday?" I'm allergic to dogs, not severely. Not EpiPen levels of allergic, but enough that my eyes water, my nose runs, and I break out in hives if they lick me. I told them this. "Oh, but you could just take some Benadryl, right?" Marcus said. "It's only for a few weeks." The few weeks turned into 6 months. Every Friday evening, they'd drop Cooper off with his bed, toys, food, and a list of instructions about his feeding schedule and exercise needs. Every weekend, I'd dose myself with antihistamines that made me feel like I was moving through molasses, walk this energetic puppy multiple times a day, clean up after him, and try not to let him lick me too much. On Monday mornings, I'd show up to work at the hospital exhausted, foggy-headed from the medication, with a slight wheeze in my chest. When the kitchen was finally finished, and I suggested they take Cooper back full-time, Victoria said, "Actually, he seems so happy with you. Are you sure you don't want to keep doing weekends? We like having the freedom to travel spontaneously." I stopped dog-sitting after that, one of my first small acts of resistance, and they responded by barely speaking to me for a month. Every holiday became a negotiation. Christmas had always been at my house, a tradition since Marcus was born. But after the wedding, Victoria's family expected us at their ranch in Fountain Hills, a sprawling estate with a staff and a wine cellar that probably cost more than my entire house. The first year, I suggested alternating, 1 year with my family, 1 year with hers. Victoria looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "But our place is so much more comfortable for everyone." By everyone, she meant her family. I started spending Christmas mornings alone, driving out to their place in the afternoon, a guest in what should have been a shared celebration. That first Christmas after their marriage, I woke up alone in my house to silence. No Marcus padding down the hallway in his slippers like when he was a child. No smell of cinnamon rolls baking, a tradition I'd started when he was 5. No stockings hung, no tree lights twinkling, no reason to celebrate in my own home. I'd put up a small tree out of habit, but I hadn't bothered to put presents under it. What was the point? I made myself coffee and sat on my porch in the cool December morning, watching my breath form clouds in the air. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was outside collecting her newspaper. "Merry Christmas, Helen," she called. "Where's that boy of yours?" "He's celebrating with his wife's family," I said, trying to sound cheerful about it. "I'm heading over there later." Mrs. Chen frowned. "On Christmas morning? But you've always had Christmas morning with Marcus." "Things change," I said, the words tasting bitter. "New family, new traditions." I drove to Fountain Hills at 2 in the afternoon, as instructed. Not too early. They'd be opening presents with Victoria's family first. Not at mealtime. I was coming for dessert and coffee, not dinner. I brought my traditional German chocolate cake, Marcus's favorite since childhood, homemade with hand-toasted coconut and pecans. The ranch was decorated like something from a magazine spread. Professional lights outside, a 14-foot tree in the great room, garlands and ribbons and candles everywhere. Constance greeted me at the door with an air kiss that didn't come close to my cheek. "Helen, you made it. We've just finished dinner. Let me take that cake to the kitchen." She disappeared with my offering, and I later found it in the kitchen, barely touched, next to 3 professionally made desserts from an expensive bakery. I sat in a wing chair in the great room, watching Victoria's extended family laugh and chat, feeling like an anthropologist observing a foreign culture. They had inside jokes I didn't understand, references to shared vacations and family events I'd never been part of. Marcus sat on the couch next to Victoria, his arm around her, looking more relaxed and at home than I'd seen him in years. Looking, I realized with a sharp pain in my chest, like he'd finally arrived where he belonged, and that place didn't include me. I kept thinking if I just proved myself valuable enough, indispensable enough, they'd realize what they had in me. I offered to teach Victoria my mother's recipes, traditions I'd hoped to pass down. She politely declined, saying she preferred a more modern approach to cooking. I suggested family dinners every Sunday, something Marcus and I used to do. They came twice, then started making excuses. Too busy with work, Victoria wasn't feeling well, they had other commitments. The thing is, I gave years of my life to this impossible mission of earning a place in their world. I worked extra shifts to have money for gifts, for contributions to their home improvements, for whatever they needed. My own health started suffering. I developed high blood pressure, probably from the stress of constantly walking on eggshells, constantly wondering if I'd said the wrong thing or overstayed my welcome. My doctor asked if something in my life had changed, and I couldn't even articulate it. How do you explain your being slowly erased from your own son's life? My doctor, Dr. Ramirez, noticed it before I did. During a routine checkup, she frowned at the blood pressure reading. "Helen, this is concerning. Your blood pressure is significantly elevated from your last visit. Are you experiencing unusual stress?" I laughed it off. "Just normal life stuff. Work, you know." She looked at me over her glasses, the way she did when she knew I wasn't being entirely honest. "Helen, I've been your doctor for 15 years. I know what your work stress looks like, and this is different. Your resting heart rate is up too. Have you had any major life changes? Family issues? Financial problems? Something about her direct kindness broke through my defenses. I found myself telling her about Marcus, about Victoria, about feeling like I was constantly trying to measure up to standards I couldn't meet. I just feel like I'm always doing something wrong, I said, surprised to hear my voice crack, like I'm this embarrassing relative they have to tolerate rather than someone they actually want around. Dr. Ramirez was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. The body keeps the score. Helen, your physical symptoms are telling you something your mind doesn't want to acknowledge. This level of stress isn't sustainable. If you don't make changes, you're going to end up with serious health problems. Is maintaining this relationship worth a heart attack or a stroke? She prescribed medication for the blood pressure, but also gave me a referral to a therapist. I tucked the referral in my purse and didn't call for another 3 months. I wasn't ready to admit that things were broken beyond my ability to fix them alone. One evening, I was having coffee with Linda, a friend who'd known Marcus since he was in Little League. We were talking about the upcoming wedding, and I was trying to put a positive spin on everything, the way I always did. Linda looked at me over her mug, her eyes full of something between pity and frustration, and said, "Helen, honey, do you realize you're being replaced?" The word hit me like a physical blow. Replaced. Not pushed aside, not overlooked, but replaced. Like an old appliance that still works, but isn't shiny or efficient enough anymore. Linda continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I've watched you bend over backwards for that boy and his wife for 3 years now, and I've watched you become smaller and smaller, like you're apologizing for existing. When was the last time Marcus called you just to talk? When was the last time they invited you over without needing something?" I wanted to defend them, to explain that they were busy, that building a marriage takes time and energy, that I understood their priorities had shifted. But sitting there in that coffee shop with its familiar smell of roasted beans and cinnamon, I couldn't think of a single example. Every interaction we'd had in the past year had been initiated by me. Every visit had been on their terms, at their convenience. Every conversation had revolved around their lives, their needs, their world. I had become a satellite orbiting their planet, hoping for the occasional gravitational pull that would bring me closer. Linda wasn't done. "Remember when Marcus was in Little League and he hit his first home run? Remember how you ran onto the field and hugged him, and he was embarrassed but also so proud? Remember how you two used to have your Sunday dinners and he'd tell you everything about his week? When did that boy turn into someone who makes you feel like you're bothering him just by existing?" The truth was, I didn't know exactly when it happened. It wasn't a single moment, but a gradual shift, like seasons changing. Maybe it started in college when he got a taste of a different life, when his roommates came from wealthy families, and he realized how different his upbringing had been. Maybe it accelerated when he got his first corporate job and started moving in circles where everyone had family money and connections. Or maybe it was always there, a latent embarrassment about where he came from, and Victoria just gave him permission to act on it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the distant sound of traffic on the interstate, and I did something I'd been avoiding for months. I looked back through our text messages, through our calls. The pattern was undeniable. I reached out, they responded when convenient. I offered help, they accepted when it suited them. I expressed hurt, they deflected or ignored. It was all there, a documentary of my own erasure, and I'd been the one holding the camera. I scrolled back 2 years in our text messages, a chronological record of my diminishing importance. 2 years ago, Marcus and I texted almost daily. He'd send me funny memes, photos of his lunch, complaints about traffic. I'd respond with mom advice, encouragement, updates from my day. The conversation was balanced, mutual, the digital equivalent of the relationship we'd always had. 18 months ago, the texts became less frequent but still warm. He'd check in a few times a week, ask how I was doing, share major news. I was still someone he thought to include in his daily life, even if that life was getting busier. A year ago, around the time the wedding planning intensified, the shift became obvious. My text to him outnumbered his to me 3-1. My questions often went unanswered for days. When he did respond, it was brief, perfunctory. Busy with work. Talk later. Can't this week. 6 months ago, I could see myself becoming desperate in those messages, asking multiple times about the same thing, suggesting plans he'd ignore, trying to insert myself into their life with offers of help, gifts, my presence. His responses were polite deflections, the kind you'd give an acquaintance who was being slightly too familiar. One exchange stood out from 3 months before the wedding. Me. Would love to take you and Victoria to dinner this week to celebrate the engagement. My treat. When works for you. 4 days later. Swamped with work stuff, maybe next month. Me. No problem. I know you're busy. How about I bring dinner to you? I could make that lasagna you love. 2 days later. We're trying to eat healthier right now. Thanks though. Me. Okay. What about just coffee? Just 30 minutes, I miss you. 1 day later, we'll check the calendar and get back to you. He never got back to me. I never brought it up again. Looking at that exchange in the harsh light of my bedroom at 2 in the morning, I saw it for what it was, begging. I'd been begging my own son for crumbs of his time and attention, and he couldn't even be bothered to spare half an hour for coffee. The wedding was 2 weeks away, and I forced myself to look in the mirror, really look. The woman staring back at me was 58 years old, with gray roots showing because I'd been too busy running errands for the wedding to get my hair done. I had dark circles under my eyes from stress, and my favorite dress hung loose because I'd lost weight from not eating properly, too anxious to have much appetite. I looked at this woman who'd given everything to everyone else, and I heard hollow words echoing in my head. We're so grateful for everything you do. You're such a help. We couldn't have done it without you. Empty phrases that people say to make themselves feel better about using someone. Have you ever looked at yourself and realized you've become a stranger? That the person you thought you were has been slowly dismantled, piece by piece, until you're just a collection of services you provide? That's what I saw in that mirror. Not a mother, not a valued family member, just a convenient resource to be tapped when needed and ignored when not. The reflection broke something in me, something that had been cracking for years, but I'd kept patching with hope and denial. I made a decision that night. No more money, not a single dollar. No more endless availability, no more rearranging my life around their needs while they barely acknowledged mine. I would attend the wedding because refusing would have hurt me more than them. But after that, things were going to change. I was going to reclaim some piece of myself, even if it meant losing them entirely. Because the truth was, I'd already lost them. I'd just been too afraid to admit it. The wedding day arrived with Phoenix's brutal June heat already shimmering off the pavement by 8 in the morning. The ceremony was at a resort in Paradise Valley, the kind of place where valet parking was mandatory, and the landscaping probably required a team of 12. I wore my lilac dress, the one I'd found on sale, but that made me feel elegant, like I still mattered. I'd gotten my hair done, a small act of defiance against my own invisibility. If I was going to be sidelined, I was going to look dignified doing it. I'd bought the lilac dress at a department store sale 3 weeks before the wedding. I'd gone alone, without the fanfare and champagne of Victoria's dress shopping expedition. I tried on a dozen dresses in a fluorescent-lit changing room, examining each one critically. The lilac one was elegant without being showy, appropriate for a mother of the groom, flattering to my skin tone. It cost $90, marked down from $200, and I felt guilty even spending that much. But I wanted to look nice. I wanted to look like I belonged there, even though I already knew I didn't. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 5:30, too anxious to sleep. I made coffee, sat on my porch watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and orange, and tried to prepare myself mentally for the day ahead. I would smile. I would be gracious. I would not cry. I would not make a scene. I would play the role expected of me, the proud mother, the supportive family member, the woman grateful to be included. I arrived at the resort at 10, earlier than necessary, because I didn't know what else to do with myself. The valet took my aging Honda, probably used to much more impressive vehicles, and I walked into the lobby feeling underdressed despite my careful preparations. Victoria's family was already there, a cluster of well-dressed people radiating confidence and wealth. Constance saw me and waved, a gesture that looked welcoming from a distance, but felt dismissive up close. "Helen, you're here early. The ceremony isn't until 2. We're all getting ready in the bridal suite upstairs, but I'm sure you can find somewhere to wait." The message was clear. I wasn't invited to the preparation activities, to the champagne and laughter and bonding that would happen in that suite. I was an afterthought, someone to be accommodated but not included. I spent the next 3 hours sitting in the resort's library, a quiet room overlooking a courtyard, reading a book I couldn't focus on. Staff members came and went, setting up for the ceremony, and they assumed I was a wedding guest, not the groom's mother. No one came looking for me. No one checked to see if I needed anything. I was invisible. The ceremony itself was beautiful in that impersonal magazine spread way. Victoria looked stunning in a dress that probably cost more than my car. Marcus looked happy but distant, like he was performing a role he'd rehearsed. I sat in the 3rd row, not the first where mothers of grooms traditionally sit. That honor went to Victoria's grandmother, a silent commentary on my status that everyone politely ignored. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, I felt a hysterical laugh building in my throat. Object to what? To my son choosing a woman who made him successful and socially acceptable? To him finally escaping the modest life I'd provided? To him becoming someone I barely recognized? From my 3rd row seat, I had a perfect view of the back of Marcus's head. I'd cut that hair when he was a little boy, given him countless home haircuts to save money. Now it was professionally styled, neat and perfect, the hair of a man who had transcended his origins. Victoria's grandmother, seated in the place that should have been mine, dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief during the vows. I wondered if anyone noticed that the groom's mother was relegated to the back, or if they just assumed this was normal, that I had chosen this seat. The vows were traditional, beautiful, meaningless to me. Marcus promised to love and cherish Victoria, to be her partner and protector. Victoria promised the same. They exchanged rings, platinum bands that caught the light, expensive and perfect. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and everyone applauded. I applauded too, my hands coming together mechanically, my face arranged in what I hoped looked like joy. The reception was where everything fell apart. I'd been seated at a table with distant relatives of Victoria's family, people I'd never met who seemed confused about who I was. "Oh, you're the groom's mother?" one woman said, her surprise barely concealed. "I thought you were seated at the family table." I smiled and said something about wanting to meet new people, but inside I was crumbling. The family table, where I should have been, was filled with Victoria's relatives, her parents holding court like royalty. My table mates were polite, but clearly uninterested in conversing with me. They talked among themselves about people and places I didn't know. Someone's yacht trip to Cabo, another's new vacation home in Aspen, a charity gala one of them was chairing. I picked at my salad, an artistic arrangement of microgreens and edible flowers that tasted like nothing, and tried to look comfortable. The woman to my left, whose name I'd already forgotten, turned to me during a lull in conversation. "So how do you know the bride and groom?" For a moment, I thought she was joking. "I'm Marcus's mother," I said. "Oh." She looked genuinely surprised, then embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I thought, well, Constance mentioned the groom's mother, but I thought you were at the head table." "No," I said, my voice tight. "I'm here." Well, she said, clearly uncomfortable now. The ceremony was lovely, wasn't it? We retreated into awkward silence, and I excused myself to the restroom just to have somewhere to go, something to do with the panic building in my chest. I'd had 2 glasses of champagne on an empty stomach when Victoria's father stood to give his toast. He spoke eloquently about his daughter's beauty, her intelligence, her bright future with Marcus. He welcomed Marcus into their family with warmth that felt genuine, and I found myself thinking bitterly that it must be nice to welcome someone rather than being merely tolerated by them. Then Victoria's mother spoke, and she talked about how happy she was to gain a son, how Marcus was exactly the kind of man they'd hoped their daughter would find. Constance's toast was delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. She stood at the head table, microphone in hand, looking elegant in a champagne-colored gown that complemented Victoria's dress. When Victoria first told us about Marcus, she began, "We knew he must be someone special. Our daughter has always had impeccable taste and high standards." The guests laughed appreciatively. I felt each word like a small cut. "Marcus, we are thrilled to welcome you into our family. You've already become like a son to us, and we look forward to many years of holidays at the ranch, family vacations, and watching you two build a beautiful life together. Victoria, my darling, you look absolutely radiant. Your father and I are so proud of the woman you've become. To the happy couple." Everyone raised their glasses. I raised mine, too, the champagne sour on my tongue, and wondered if anyone noticed that she talked about welcoming Marcus into their family while I had never been acknowledged as part of it. When it was my turn, I stood on shaky legs, my prepared speech suddenly feeling inadequate and pathetic. I talked about Marcus as a boy, about raising him alone, about watching him grow into a man I was proud of. My voice cracked when I welcomed Victoria to our family, because even as I said it, I knew our family was already just me, alone, pretending to be part of something I'd lost. I could see people checking their phones, Victoria looking impatient, Marcus studying his champagne glass like it held the secrets of the universe. I'd written my toast on a note card, practiced it a dozen times in front of my bathroom mirror. But standing there with all those eyes on me, the words felt hollow. "I want to talk about Marcus as a little boy," I said, my voice not as strong as I'd hoped. "When he was 8, he came home from school one day and told me he was going to be an astronaut. He'd learned about space in science class, and he was absolutely convinced that he'd walk on Mars someday." I paused, hoping for warm laughter or recognition from Marcus, but he was staring at the table, his jaw tight. I continued. I told him that if anyone could do it, he could, and while he didn't become an astronaut, he did reach for the stars in his own way. He worked hard, he made something of himself, and I'm incredibly proud of the man he's become. More silence, punctuated only by the clinking of glasses and shuffling of feet. I hurried through the rest. "Victoria, welcome to our family. I hope we can build a relationship and create many happy memories together. To Marcus and Victoria." The toast echoed in the ballroom and died quickly. People raised their glasses dutifully, drank, and immediately resumed their conversations. I sat down, my hands shaking, and finished my champagne in one long gulp. The moment that destroyed everything came during the dinner service. I'd gone to the restroom, and when I returned, I overheard Victoria talking to a group of her friends near the bar. Her voice was clear and carrying, amplified by champagne and the confidence of someone who's never had to watch their words. Honestly, Marcus's mother has been such a handful throughout this whole process. So many opinions about things she doesn't understand, trying to insert herself into every decision. I swear, planning this wedding would have been so much easier without her constant interference. Her friends laughed, and one of them said something I couldn't quite catch. Victoria's response was crystal clear. "Well, At least now we can have a real family without the constant interference. Marcus and I are finally free to build our life the way we want it, without someone always trying to drag us back to her level. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart hammering so hard I thought people could hear it. The thing about betrayal is that it's not the worst when it surprises you. It's worst when it confirms what you'd been denying to yourself, when it validates every fear you'd been pushing down. I'd known, somewhere deep inside, that they saw me as a burden. But hearing it spoken out loud, hearing my son's wife describe me as an obstacle to overcome, something to escape from, that turned knowing into believing. The words replayed in my head on a loop. Drag us back to her level. Like I was contamination, something dirty they had to rise above. Like the years I'd spent working double shifts to give Marcus opportunities were shameful rather than noble. Like love and sacrifice meant nothing compared to money and social status. I wanted to march over there, to confront her in front of her friends, to make her acknowledge what she'd said. But what would that accomplish? She'd deny it, or claim I'd misunderstood, or worst of all, she'd own it and confirm that yes, this is exactly how they see me, and they're not even ashamed of it. So instead, I turned around and walked back to my table, each step feeling like I was wading through concrete. I walked back into that ballroom like I was moving through water, everything slowed down and distant. The speeches continued, people laughed and danced, and I sat at my exile table, invisible in my lilac dress, watching my son celebrate a life that had no room for me in it. When someone asked if I was okay, I said I had a headache, which was true in the most literal sense. My head felt like it was splitting open, like my brain was trying to escape the reality it had to process. I left early, before the cake cutting, before the first dance. No one noticed except the valet who brought my car around and wished me a good evening. I drove home through the dark Phoenix streets, past strip malls and gas stations and all the ordinary places that make up a life, and I thought about how we convince ourselves of things that aren't true because the truth is too painful to bear. I'd convinced myself that my sacrifices mattered, that my love was enough, that eventually they'd see my value. But love without reciprocity isn't love, it's servitude. And I'd been serving a family that had already decided I wasn't good enough to be part of it. The drive home took 40 minutes, but it felt like hours. I kept replaying Victoria's words, kept seeing Marcus's face during my toast, embarrassed, uncomfortable, wishing I would stop talking about his childhood, about the life he'd worked so hard to transcend. The streets were empty, and I drove on autopilot, barely registering traffic lights or turns. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for 10 minutes, staring at my modest house with its peeling paint and overgrown desert landscaping. This house that I'd been so ashamed of, that I'd apologized for, that I'd seen through their eyes as inadequate, it was mine. I'd bought it with my own money, maintained it with my own hands, filled it with memories of raising a boy who no longer wanted to remember where he came from. That night, alone in my house with its mortgage I'd extended to help with their down payment, I made another decision. I was going to stop pretending. Stop pretending their cruelty was acceptable. Stop pretending I deserved this treatment. Stop pretending that if I just tried harder, everything would be fine. I had spent years of my life believing that loyalty and effort would be rewarded, that a mother's love could overcome any obstacle. But some obstacles don't want to be overcome. Some people don't want your love. They just want what you can provide. It was around this time that something unexpected happened. I'd started going to a grief support group, not because anyone had died, but because I was grieving the loss of the relationship I'd thought I had with my son. The facilitator was a woman named Sarah, a spiritual counselor who'd helped countless people navigate loss and reinvention. She had this way of cutting through nonsense that I found both terrifying and liberating. The grief support group met every Tuesday evening in a community center on the west side of Phoenix. I'd found it through a flyer at Dr. Ramirez's office, a simple photocopied sheet advertising support for complicated grief and loss. I almost didn't go to the first meeting. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 15 minutes, telling myself that I didn't belong there, that my situation wasn't the same as people who'd lost loved ones to death, that I was being dramatic. But I walked in anyway, and I'm glad I did. The room held about 12 people, sitting in a circle of folding chairs. Sarah, the facilitator, was maybe 60, with silver hair. She wore long and loose, laugh lines around her eyes, and a presence that was both calm and commanding. She welcomed me without making a big deal of my arrival, simply gestured to an empty chair and introduced herself during the opening. The first few meetings I mostly listened. People shared stories about dead spouses, estranged children, siblings they'd lost to addiction or disease or irreparable conflict. I heard my own pain echoed in their words. The confusion of grieving someone who was still alive, the guilt of feeling angry at someone you loved, the shame of not being able to fix what was broken. During one session, I'd been talking about the wedding, about feeling replaced, and Sarah interrupted me. "Helen, I need you to hear something important. You keep talking about what they did to you, but what I'm hearing is what you allowed. You taught them how to treat you by accepting unacceptable behavior over and over again." The words stung, but she wasn't done. Your self-worth can't come from their approval. It has to come from you, and right now, you don't even know who you are outside of being Marcus's mother. When was the last time you did something just for yourself? I couldn't answer, because I couldn't remember. Every decision I'd made in the past 3 years had been filtered through the question of how it would affect my relationship with Marcus and Victoria. Where I went, what I spent money on, how I spent my time, all of it revolved around maintaining a connection that was already broken. Sarah gave me homework that felt impossible. Make one decision every day based solely on what I wanted, with no consideration for anyone else's opinion or needs. The homework was harder than I expected. That first day, I stood in the grocery store, frozen in the cereal aisle, trying to choose what I wanted for breakfast. For years, I'd bought the cereal Marcus liked when he visited, even though those visits had become rare. Standing there, looking at rows of boxes, I realized I didn't even know what cereal I preferred. I'd been making choices based on other people's preferences for so long that my own had atrophied. I chose a granola that looked interesting, with dried cherries and almonds. At home, I ate it for breakfast the next morning and discovered I didn't particularly like it, too sweet, too crunchy. But the act of choosing it for myself, of discovering my own preference through trial and error, felt revolutionary. The first decision I made was about money. Marcus had casually mentioned they were thinking about remodeling their master bathroom, and the old me would have immediately offered to contribute. Instead, I said nothing. When he brought it up more directly, asking if I could help with costs, I said no. Not with excuses, not with explanations, just no. The silence on the phone was deafening, followed by, "But you helped with the kitchen remodel." I took a breath and said, "That was then. This is now. I need to prioritize my own financial security." He was shocked, genuinely shocked, that I would refuse. It had never occurred to him that I might have limits, that the well of my generosity might have a bottom. Victoria got on the phone, her voice sweet, but with an edge underneath. "Helen, we thought you'd want to be part of making our home beautiful. It's where your future grandchildren will grow up." The manipulation was so obvious it almost made me laugh. "Then I'm sure you'll make it beautiful yourselves," I said, and ended the call. My hands were shaking when I hung up. I felt guilty, like I'd failed some fundamental test of motherhood. But I also felt something else, a tiny spark of pride, of self-respect I hadn't felt in years. I'd set a boundary. I'd said no. The world hadn't ended. That night, I read something Sarah had sent me, an article about psychological vulnerability and abuse. One line stood out. Studies indicate that psychological vulnerability increases the risk of being victimized again. I realized that's what I'd been doing, making myself vulnerable over and over, offering myself up to be hurt because I couldn't imagine an alternative. The article talked about setting boundaries, about recognizing when someone consistently disregards your feelings, about understanding that you teach people how to treat you. I started making other changes. I stopped responding to texts immediately, stopped rearranging my schedule to accommodate theirs, stopped offering help that wasn't requested. I took a weekend trip to Sedona by myself, something I'd wanted to do for years but had never prioritized. I sat among those red rocks, feeling small in a good way, like my problems were tiny compared to the geological time that had created this beauty. I started saying no without elaborate justifications. I started asking myself what I wanted instead of what would make them happy. The Sedona trip was my first vacation alone in probably 30 years. I drove up on a Friday morning, the landscape shifting from Phoenix's desert browns to Sedona's dramatic red rocks. I'd booked a modest hotel room with a balcony overlooking Oak Creek, something I'd found online for a reasonable price. That first evening, I sat on the balcony, watching the sunset turn the rocks from red to orange to purple, and I cried. Not from sadness exactly, but from release. The tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders for years, the constant vigilance about saying or doing the wrong thing, the exhausting effort of trying to earn love that should have been freely given. All of it seemed to pour out of me with those tears. I hiked the next day, a moderate trail that wound between red rock formations with names like Coffee Pot and Thunder Mountain. I wasn't in great shape, and I had to stop frequently to catch my breath, but I was moving at my own pace, accountable to no one. I met other hikers on the trail, and we exchanged friendly greetings, comments about the view, simple human interactions that expected nothing from me beyond basic courtesy. That night, I treated myself to dinner at a nice restaurant, something I would never have done before because it felt wasteful to spend money on myself. I ordered wine, a good steak, dessert. I sat at a table for one with a book, completely comfortable in my own company, and it felt like a radical act of self-care. The shift in my behavior confused them. Marcus started calling more often, but the conversations were strange. Like he was trying to figure out what had changed. I wasn't angry or emotional. I was just detached, and that seemed to unnerve him more than anger would have. Victoria invited me to lunch, a rare occurrence, and I could see her studying me, trying to understand this new version of me that didn't eagerly accept every crumb of attention. The lunch invitation came via text. "Would you like to meet for lunch this Saturday? There's a new cafe in Old Town Scottsdale I've been wanting to try." The old me would have responded immediately with enthusiastic acceptance. The new me waited 6 hours and then replied, "I'll check my schedule and let you know." I did have plans that Saturday, a painting class at the community center, but I rearranged them. Not because Victoria asked, but because I was curious about what she wanted. We met at the cafe, a trendy place with Edison bulb lighting and a menu full of grain bowls and artisanal toasts. Victoria was already there when I arrived, looking effortlessly stylish in jeans and a silk blouse. She stood to hug me, and I accepted the embrace without reciprocating the enthusiasm. We ordered. She got a kale and quinoa bowl, I got a turkey sandwich, and then she got to the point. "Helen, I wanted to talk to you because Marcus and I have been concerned. You've seemed distant lately, and when Marcus asked about helping with the bathroom remodel, your response was pretty cold." She said this like she was doing me a favor by confronting me, like my behavior was a problem that needed addressing. I took a sip of my iced tea, considering my response. The old me would have apologized, would have explained that I hadn't meant to seem cold, would have scrambled to reassure her that everything was fine. The new me said, "I've been setting some boundaries around my time and money. It's not personal." Boundaries. She said the word like it was foreign. "But we're family." "Exactly," I said. "And family relationships should be reciprocal. I need to make sure I'm taking care of myself, not just always taking care of everyone else. She looked genuinely confused, like the concept of me having needs was something that had never occurred to her. The lunch continued awkwardly, and when we parted, she hugged me again and said, "I hope everything's okay, Helen. You know we're here if you need anything." The irony was lost on her. I decided I needed to confront them, to say out loud what I'd been feeling. But I wanted to do it on my terms, in a setting where I felt some control. I invited them to my house, to the modest living room they'd always seemed uncomfortable in, with its second-hand furniture and family photos on the walls. They arrived together, sitting on my couch like they were visiting a distant relative out of obligation. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, but when the moment came, the words felt inadequate. How do you explain to someone that they've broken your heart in 1,000 small ways? How do you make them understand the cumulative weight of dismissals and slights and being made to feel lesser? I tried anyway. I told them about the wedding, about overhearing Victoria's comments. I talked about feeling replaced, about the financial contributions I'd made that were never acknowledged, about the time and energy I'd poured into a relationship that seemed entirely one-sided. I'd spent days preparing for this conversation, writing down what I wanted to say, anticipating their responses, steeling myself for the confrontation. The morning they were scheduled to come over, I cleaned my house obsessively, then wondered why I was bothering. This wasn't about impressing them. It was about being honest. They arrived 15 minutes late, which somehow felt symbolic. Marcus kissed my cheek distractedly. Victoria commented on how warm it was in my house, a subtle criticism of my aging air conditioning system. We sat in the living room, them on the couch, me in the armchair across from them, and I felt like we were strangers meeting to discuss a business matter rather than family talking about our relationship. Marcus looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. "Mom, you're being overly sensitive. Victoria didn't mean anything by it. She was just venting with her friends." I felt something cold settle in my chest at those words. Not an apology, not acknowledgement, just dismissal of my feelings as invalid. Victoria sat silent, her expression carefully neutral, like she was waiting for this inconvenient conversation to be over. I continued, my voice steady, even as my hand shook. "I've given you $20,000 that you've never paid back. I've babysat your dog for 6 months despite being allergic. I've reorganized my entire life around your needs and schedules. And in return, I get seated at the outsider's table at your wedding and described as an obstacle you're relieved to escape from. I need you to understand that this isn't sustainable. I can't keep being the only person fighting for this relationship." There was a long silence. Then Victoria spoke for the first time. "Helen, I think maybe you've built up some resentment that isn't really about us. Have you considered talking to someone? A therapist might help you process these feelings more constructively." The suggestion was delivered with concern that felt performative, and I realized with stunning clarity that they weren't going to change. This confrontation wasn't going to lead to understanding or reconciliation. They didn't see themselves as having done anything wrong. Marcus added, "We're grateful for everything you've done, Mom. We really are. But Victoria's right. Maybe you need to work through some of these feelings with a professional. You seem really stressed lately." They were gaslighting me, I realized, making my legitimate grievances seem like symptoms of instability. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, going in circles, with me trying to explain and them gently suggesting I was the problem. When they left, they hugged me like nothing significant had happened, like we just had a minor disagreement about what to have for dinner. I closed the door behind them and felt something shift inside me. This was it, the moment of reckoning. They weren't going to apologize. They weren't going to change their behavior. They weren't going to suddenly see me as valuable and important. Whatever justice I was going to get, whatever peace I was going to find, It wasn't going to come from them. It was going to have to come from inside me, from my own ability to let go and move forward without their validation. But do you think that was fair? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? Should I have fought harder, demanded more, or was walking away the only real option? I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, about whether I gave up too easily or held on too long, and I still don't have a clear answer. What I did know was that I couldn't keep living in this limbo, hoping for a relationship that existed only in my imagination. So I made a choice that felt radical and terrifying. I decided to build a life that didn't revolve around being Marcus's mother. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I needed to love myself more than I needed his approval. I started small because that's all I had the energy for. I signed up for a painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but had dismissed as frivolous. I was terrible at it initially, my landscapes looking like a child's finger paintings, but there was something liberating about creating something purely for my own enjoyment, with no one to judge or criticize. The instructor, a retired art teacher named Margaret, became a friend. We started having coffee after class, talking about art and life and everything except my son. Margaret was in her 70s, with paint-stained fingers and a laugh that came from deep in her belly. She taught art in public schools for 40 years before retiring, and she approached our amateur painting class with the same enthusiasm she'd probably brought to teaching kindergartners. "There are no mistakes in art," she'd say, "only opportunities for creative problem-solving." My first painting was of a desert sunset, all oranges and purples bleeding into each other with no discernible horizon line. It looked like a bruise, honestly. But Margaret stood behind me and said, "I love the emotional quality of your color choices. You're painting how the sunset feels, not just how it looks." Whether or not that was true, her encouragement made me want to try again. We started getting coffee after class at a diner near the community center, sitting in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, drinking bottomless cups of mediocre coffee. Margaret talked about her late husband, who'd died 5 years earlier, about how she'd had to rebuild her identity as a single woman after 45 years of marriage. "You think you know who you are," she said, "and then the person you've defined yourself in relation to is gone, and you're left with this question: who am I now?" I told her about Marcus, about Victoria, about the wedding. She listened without judgment, without offering platitudes or advice, just nodding and making sympathetic sounds. When I was done, she said, "Grief is grief, whether the person died or just stopped being who you thought they were. Give yourself permission to mourn." I cut back my hours at the hospital, something I'd never considered because I'd always wanted to have extra money available for Marcus's needs. Instead, I used that time for myself, reading books I'd been meaning to get to, taking walks in the desert at sunset, sitting on my porch with iced tea and watching the world go by. These sound like small things, and they were, but they were mine, not borrowed, not conditional, not dependent on someone else's approval. The relationship with Marcus and Victoria didn't end dramatically. There was no final confrontation, no slamming of doors. It just quietly contracted, like a balloon slowly deflating. They stopped calling as often, and when they did, the conversations were surface level and brief. I stopped initiating contact, stopped trying to manufacture closeness that wasn't organic. Holidays became exchanged pleasantries rather than shared experiences. I sent birthday cards but stopped hosting elaborate celebrations. When they had their first child, I visited the hospital briefly, brought a modest gift, and left before overstaying my welcome. Here's the strange thing about letting go. It hurts less than holding on did. The constant anxiety about saying the wrong thing, doing too much or too little, being too present or not present enough, that disappeared. I stopped checking my phone compulsively for messages that rarely came. I stopped running through conversations in my head, analyzing every word for hidden meanings. I stopped living in a state of perpetual apology for existing. The relief was profound. Sarah helped me understand that I'd been giving from a place of deficit, trying to earn love that should have been freely given. "You can't pour from an empty cup," she said, "and yours has been bone dry for years. You've been operating on fumes and calling it love." She was right. I'd convinced myself that sacrificing my own needs was noble, that a good mother puts her child first no matter what. But there's a difference between healthy sacrifice and self-destruction, between generous love and desperate appeasement. I started exploring what brought me joy outside of relationships, outside of being needed by someone. I discovered I loved hiking in the early morning hours when the desert was still cool and the light was golden. I found a volunteer position at a literacy center, teaching adults to read, which gave me a sense of purpose that didn't depend on familial obligation. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my years of trying to maintain my relationship with Marcus, friends who welcomed me back without judgment or conditions. The volunteer work at the literacy center became one of the most meaningful parts of my new life. I worked with adults who'd never learned to read, or who'd lost literacy skills due to strokes or brain injuries, or immigrants learning English as a second language. Their struggles put my own in perspective. These were people fighting to acquire basic skills most people took for granted, and they showed up week after week with determination and hope. I worked primarily with a woman named Rosa, who'd immigrated from Mexico 30 years earlier and had gotten by with minimal English and no reading skills, relying on her children to translate and navigate written communication. Now, at 55, with her children grown and busy with their own lives, she'd decided to learn. We met twice a week, working through basic primers, sounding out words, celebrating small victories like reading a grocery store sign or a text message from her daughter. Rosa's gratitude for my time and patience was humbling. She thanked me profusely after every session, brought me homemade tamales, told me I was changing her life. I wanted to tell her that she was changing mine too, that teaching her gave me a sense of purpose and value that had nothing to do with blood relation or obligation, that she saw me as important in a way my own son no longer did. The financial aspect of my freedom was significant too. Without constantly contributing to Marcus and Victoria's lifestyle, I was able to rebuild my savings. I refinanced my house, removing the extension I'd taken for their down payment, and started actually planning for my own retirement instead of assuming I'd work until I dropped. I bought myself small luxuries, good coffee, fresh flowers for my kitchen table, a subscription to a streaming service. These things didn't change my life, but they represented a shift in priorities, from other-focused to self-focused, that felt revolutionary. There were hard moments. Seeing Marcus's Facebook posts about his family, his career, his life that I was barely part of, that still stung. Holidays were lonely sometimes, sitting in my house while knowing they were celebrating together without me. I wondered if I'd made the wrong choice, if I should have just accepted whatever relationship they were willing to give me, if partial connection was better than this distance. But then I'd remember how I'd felt at that wedding, how small and insignificant, and I knew that accepting crumbs wasn't actually connection at all. About a year after I'd started this process of reclaiming my life, something unexpected happened. Marcus called, and his voice was different, uncertain, almost vulnerable. Victoria had left him. She'd been having an affair with someone from her work, someone wealthier and better connected, and she'd filed for divorce. He was devastated, his world shattered, and he was calling me because he needed someone. Part of me felt a bitter satisfaction, a sense that karma had finally caught up with them. But mostly, I just felt sad. The call came on a Tuesday evening. I was making dinner, a simple pasta with vegetables, when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I'd been screening calls from numbers I didn't recognize, tired of telemarketers. But I saw it was Marcus and picked up. "Mom?" His voice was rough, like he'd been crying. "Marcus, what's wrong? Can I come over? I need to talk to someone." He'd never asked to come over before, not in the 3 years since the wedding. He'd always waited for invitations, treating my house like a place he visited out of obligation. But now, in crisis, he was asking. I could have said no, could have told him I had plans, could have made him wait the way he'd made me wait so many times. But I'm still his mother, and some instincts run deeper than hurt. "Of course," I said. "Come now if you want." We met for coffee, and I listened as he poured out his pain and confusion. He talked about feeling betrayed, about not seeing it coming, about thinking their marriage was solid. I wanted to point out the irony, wanted to say that now he understood how I'd felt, but I didn't. Instead, I offered what comfort I could, held space for his grief, and then went home to my own life. I helped him, but I didn't rescue him. I was supportive, but I didn't make his crisis my crisis. It was a different kind of relationship, one with boundaries that protected both of us. He told me everything over coffee that stretched into hours. Victoria had been seeing her colleague for 6 months. She'd grown tired of Marcus, found someone who could offer her even more status, even greater wealth. She'd moved out while Marcus was on a business trip, leaving a note on the kitchen counter and taking most of the furniture they'd bought together, including pieces I'd helped pay for. "I don't understand how I missed it," Marcus said. His hands wrapped around his coffee cup like he needed the warmth. "I thought we were happy. I thought we had everything we wanted." I could have said many things. I could have pointed out that you can't build a marriage on status and wealth, that Victoria had shown her true character from the beginning, that he'd chosen to ignore warning signs, just like I'd ignored warning signs about how they treated me. But his pain was real, and adding to it wouldn't heal anything. "I'm sorry you're going through this," I said instead. "Betrayal is devastating, especially from someone you trusted completely." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw recognition flicker across his face. Maybe he was remembering the wedding, remembering Victoria's words that I'd overheard, remembering the ways they'd both betrayed my trust and my love. He didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge it out loud, but something shifted in his expression. In the months that followed, Marcus and I found a new equilibrium. We talked occasionally, saw each other sometimes, but it was on equal footing rather than the desperate, one-sided dynamic we'd had before. He never apologized for the wedding or for the years of taking me for granted, and I didn't ask him to. I'd learned that apologies don't heal wounds if the person doesn't understand what they did wrong. And Marcus still seemed to view our past as normal family dynamics rather than a slow erosion of my dignity. I made peace with not getting the closure I wanted. Some stories don't end with dramatic revelations or heartfelt reconciliations. Sometimes justice is just the quiet knowledge that you survived, that you found yourself again, that you built a life worth living despite the pain. My justice wasn't external. There were no consequences for Marcus and Victoria's treatment of me, no public acknowledgement of their behavior, no karmic retribution that made everything balance out. My justice was internal, the peace of knowing I was no longer willing to diminish myself for someone else's comfort. I found my rebirth in simplicity, in a life stripped of the complicated emotional negotiations that had consumed my energy for so long. I stopped trying to be impressive or indispensable. I stopped performing the role of the selfless mother who asked for nothing and gave everything. I allowed myself to be ordinary, flawed, human, with needs and wants that mattered just as much as anyone else's. The freedom in that was immense. My small house in Phoenix, the one I'd once been ashamed of compared to their Paradise Valley mansion, became my sanctuary. I painted the walls colors I liked, hung art that spoke to me, filled the space with plants that thrived in the desert heat. I created a home that was mine alone, that didn't need to impress anyone or accommodate anyone else's aesthetic preferences. On Sunday mornings, I made elaborate breakfasts just for myself, sitting on my porch with good coffee and fresh fruit, watching hummingbirds dart among the sage bushes. I developed a small circle of friends, people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. We had potluck dinners, where everyone brought something simple, and we laughed about nothing important. I started dating, tentatively at first, and while nothing serious developed, it reminded me that I was still a person worthy of attention and affection, still capable of connection that wasn't based on obligation or manipulation. These relationships were light and easy, refreshingly uncomplicated after years of emotional minefield navigation. The question I get asked most often, by the few people who know my story, is whether I regret the years I spent trying to maintain a relationship with Marcus and Victoria. The honest answer is complicated. I regret the toll it took on my health, my finances, my sense of self. I regret allowing myself to be diminished and dismissed. But I don't regret trying, because trying was an expression of love, even if that love wasn't reciprocated the way I needed it to be. What I learned is that you can love someone and still choose yourself, that prioritizing your own well-being isn't selfish or cruel, it's necessary. The relationship I have with Marcus now is cordial but distant. We exchange texts on birthdays and holidays. We see each other a few times a year for brief, surface-level visits. He's remarried, to someone kinder than Victoria, but still part of a world that feels foreign to me. I'm not close to my grandchildren, which hurts in moments when I let myself think about it. But I've accepted that I can't force a relationship that isn't organically developing. They have their life, I have mine, and those lives occasionally intersect without merging. It's not what I dreamed of, but it's sustainable, and sustainability matters more than intensity when you're building a life meant to last. Before I close this story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this, something that might help you if you're in a similar situation or know someone who is. The educational piece that nobody talks about when we discuss family dynamics and being sidelined is this: recovery is possible, but it starts with recognizing that you deserve better. See, the thing about being slowly erased from someone's life is that it happens so gradually you don't notice you're participating in your own disappearance. You make one small concession, then another, until you've conceded so much of yourself there's barely anything left. And because each concession seems minor in isolation, you don't recognize the pattern until you're drowning in it. So the first step in recovery is acknowledging the pattern exists, naming it, refusing to participate in it anymore. Here's what I wish I'd known earlier. Healthy relationships require reciprocity. Not perfect balance every single day, but over time. There should be a general equilibrium of give and take, of effort and care, of consideration and respect. If you find yourself constantly giving while the other person is constantly taking, that's not a relationship. It's exploitation, even if it's wrapped in the language of family obligation or maternal duty. You're allowed to expect that the people who claim to love you will demonstrate that love through actions, not just accept your demonstrations of love without reciprocating. The warning signs I missed were numerous. If someone consistently dismisses your feelings as invalid or overly sensitive, that's a red flag. If you're always the one initiating contact, making plans, offering help while they're passively receiving, that's a red flag. If you feel like you're constantly walking on eggshells, monitoring every word and action to avoid disapproval, that's a red flag. If your contributions, financial, emotional, practical, are expected rather than appreciated, that's a red flag. I saw all these signs and explained them away because I wanted so desperately to believe in the relationship I thought we had. Setting boundaries is terrifying when you've never done it before, especially with adult children who've grown accustomed to your unconditional availability. But boundaries aren't punishments or rejections. They're guidelines for how you're willing to be treated, what you're willing to accept, where your limits are. Saying no to financial requests isn't withholding love, it's protecting your own security. Declining to drop everything for someone else's convenience isn't selfishness, it's self-respect. Expecting basic courtesy and consideration isn't demanding too much. It's requiring the minimum standard of human decency. The recovery process is slow and often painful. You'll have moments where you doubt yourself, where you wonder if you're being unreasonable, where you're tempted to fall back into old patterns because they're familiar, even if they're harmful. That's normal. Change is uncomfortable, especially when you're changing dynamics that have been established for years. Be patient with yourself. Celebrate small victories. The first time you say no without apologizing, the first day you don't check your phone anxiously for messages, the first activity you do purely for your own enjoyment. Build a support system outside the problematic relationship. This is crucial, whether it's friends, a therapist, a support group, or a spiritual counselor like Sarah was for me. You need people who can offer perspective, validation, and encouragement when you're struggling. These people can help you see your situation clearly when you're tempted to minimize or rationalize behavior that's hurting you. They can remind you of your worth when you're doubting it. They can celebrate your progress when you're too close to it to recognize how far you've come. Focus on building a life that has meaning and purpose, independent of the relationship that's causing you pain. This doesn't mean you stop loving your child or cut them off entirely. It means you stop making them the center of your universe, the source of your identity and self-worth. Develop interests, cultivate friendships, pursue goals that are yours alone. Create a life so full and satisfying that their absence leaves a gap but doesn't create a void. When your happiness depends on one person's approval or presence, you've given them too much power over your well-being. Understand that you can't control other people's behavior, only your own response to it. You can't make Marcus recognize what he lost. You can't force Victoria to treat you with respect. You can't compel them to value your contributions or appreciate your sacrifices. What you can do is decide what you're willing to tolerate, what you're willing to give, how you're willing to be treated. You can choose to stop participating in dynamics that diminish you. You can walk away from situations that consistently leave you feeling small and worthless. Finally, and this is perhaps the most important thing, forgive yourself for the time it took you to recognize the problem and take action. We're conditioned to believe that mothers should accept any treatment from their children, that unconditional love means unconditional tolerance of mistreatment, that walking away or setting boundaries makes us bad parents. None of that is true. You're not a failure because you couldn't make someone love you the way you deserve to be loved. You're not weak because you tried for years before you stopped trying. You're not selfish because you finally chose yourself. You're human, and you're worthy of the same care and consideration you've been giving others. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. I know it's not the dramatic revenge tale where the villain gets their comeuppance and everyone lives happily ever after. Real life is messier than that, more ambiguous, less satisfying in some ways. But there's power in the truth, in acknowledging that sometimes the best we can do is survive, heal, and build something new from the wreckage of what we lost. I'd love to know what city you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Are you dealing with something similar? Have you had to make hard choices about family relationships? If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button. It helps me know these stories are reaching people who need them. And please, leave a comment telling me what you would have done in my place. Would you have fought harder, left sooner, found a different path entirely? Your perspective might help someone else who's struggling with these same questions. If you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing to this channel. I share stories like this regularly, real experiences from real people navigating the complicated landscape of family, betrayal,